video, I'm going to show you 2 sewing stitches that you can use when making up your knitting project. To make up your knitting project, you will need an embroidery needle with a large head, like this one, so the head is big enough for the yarn to go through the hole. If you only have a needle with a smaller head, like this one, you could make up your knitting project using a thinner piece of embroidery yarn. The 2 stitches I'm going to show you are called the Overstitch and Blanket Stitch. This is the first stitch, the Overstitch, and the Blanket Stitch. Either of these can be used to make up your knitting project. Usually when making up your knitting project, you would use the yarn left over on the long tail of your knitting project rather than using a new piece of yarn, but to make it easier for you to see, I'm going to use a different colour. If you're following the Knitty Bee pattern for making knitted sushi, this is your rice, and you fold the piece in half to make the basic shape. Now to secure it, you need to sew along 3 edges. So first I'm going to show you the Overstitch, which is the first one we saw on this piece. Now when you're sewing together your knitting project, you should be careful not to spear your sewing needle through the middle of a piece of yarn, because what that does is it makes it weaker and easier to snap. When you're putting your needle through, you should aim to put it directly through a stitch that's already in existence and that is big enough to accommodate the yarn you're putting through. So for the Overstitch, it's quite simple. Obviously you secure the end of the yarn when you're doing it properly. First you put the needle through the 2 pieces, so they're joined, and basically you just repeat. Space out your stitches evenly, and remember to try and not spear the needle through the middle of a piece of yarn that's already creating a stitch. Pull the stitches tight, but not too tight. You don't want to distort the shape of your knitting project. When you're using a piece of yarn that's the same colour as your project, you won't really be able to see these stitches, but as you can see with the different colour here, it forms a sort of pattern as you do the same stitch over and again. So that's the Overstitch. It's quite simple, quite neat, and very easy to do. Blanket Stitch is very similar. So again, to begin with, you pass your needle through the 2 pieces, and then with Blanket Stitch you do the same again. Before you pull the needle out, you take this loop that's been created and pass it over the top of the needle so that the stitch is caught inside of that loop. And then the same again, up through the 2 pieces, put the loop over the top and pull. As you can see here, the pattern's a bit different to the one on the other side. I think Blanket Stitch is a little bit more difficult, but possibly the nicer of the 2 stitches. So there we have 2 different stitches you can use when making up your knitted sushi.